Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping straight into a really fascinating, highly provocative framework from our source material. We're going to look at how the author applies evolutionary psychology, specifically the theories of Gad Saad, to one of the most debated, heavily scrutinized alliances in modern history, the U.S.-Israel relationship. Now, right up front, we aren't taking a side here today. Instead, we're going to step entirely inside the source's framework to really understand this rigorous, step-by-step clinical diagnosis of geopolitical strategy. So here's our roadmap for the analysis. First, we'll break down the empathy pathology. Second, we'll run through the three-step diagnosis. Third, we'll measure the alleged strategic costs. Fourth, we'll examine the main strategic asset rebuttal. And finally, we'll unpack a rather haunting biological metaphor, the parasitic wood cricket. All right, part 1, the empathy pathology, an evolutionary misfire. So Gad Saad takes this concept from evolutionary psychiatrist Randy Nest, but he's not talking about your everyday normal sympathy. He defines suicidal empathy as a specific evolutionary pathology. It's the hyperactivation of an adaptive emotional response, but in a context where it produces totally catastrophic outcomes for the survival of the empathizer. You can kind of think of it like an autoimmune disease of the mind, right? It's an evolutionary misfire where a genuinely noble virtue gets aimed at the completely wrong target and in the completely wrong amount. Now, you really have to understand the difference here between healthy and pathological empathy. Calibrated empathy is healthy. It uses a built-in evolutionary cost-benefit calculus. It recognizes who is in your group and who isn't, and ultimately it preserves survival. Suicidal empathy, on the other hand, it just eradicates that calculus entirely. The source text makes it clear that this pathology ignores strategic boundaries, it extends totally unconditional indulgence no matter how the recipient behaves, and, this is key, it uniquely justifies this massive cost by appealing to some vague, higher, noble goal. Well, what's actually driving this massive misfire? The text argues the main engine here is civilizational guilt. Basically, elites feel guilty over their civilization's past, so they seek out moral expiation through performative generosity. Saad calls this selling indulgences, which ultimately leads to civilizational seppuku. But here is the really critical dynamic at play. The politicians who are buying these moral indulgences, they aren't the ones actually paying the price. The consequences are completely decoupled from the decision makers. The actual, heavy strategic costs fall entirely on everyday taxpayers, deployed soldiers, and diplomats. Okay, moving on to Section 2, the three-step diagnosis, testing for pathology. Saad's framework gives us this very clear clinical sequence to actually test for this pathology in the real world. Step 1, identify the unconditional commitment. Step 2, trace the predictable consequence, which is usually the recipient's bad behavior. And Step 3, measure the resulting harm to the patron's own survival interests. And according to the source material, all three of these steps are highly measurable in the historical American relationship with Israel. Let's apply Step 1, identifying that unconditional commitment. Since 1948, the United States has provided Israel with over $310 billion in inflation-adjusted aid. Let that sink in. It is literally the largest cumulative foreign assistance package in American history. And, crucially, according to the analysis, it has been handed over with absolutely no meaningful conditionality attached to it. The source argues that this aid simply does not decrease even when American policy preferences are blatantly ignored. And we know this commitment has been heavily tested over the decades. The source highlights some really serious friction points here. The 1967 attack on the USS Liberty, where 34 American sailors were killed. The 1987 conviction of Jonathan Pollard for massive espionage against the U.S. What the author describes as an insulting announcement of settlement expansions right during a 2010 vice presidential visit, or the 2015 address to Congress designed to explicitly undermine a sitting U.S. president. The text emphasizes that through every single one of these severe tests, American aid just continued without a hitch. Which brings us to Step 2, the predictable bad behavior. When a patron signals that their support is completely unconditional, the recipient rationally learns that they can just ignore preferences without any penalty. The author calls this the Oslo syndrome. Think of it like parenting, right? If a teenager faces absolutely zero consequences for breaking curfew every night, they have zero incentive to suddenly start following the rules. Unconditional generosity doesn't transform the recipient into a better ally. The author argues it literally removes their incentive to be transformed in the first place. And that leads us to Section 3, measuring the strategic costs, symptoms of pathology. So what is the actual measurable drain on the U.S.? The source categorizes these severe strategic costs across three domains. In military readiness, the text points out the U.S. has sent $18 billion in emergency munitions since October 2023. That's actively depleting the exact stockpiles the U.S. would desperately need for pure conflict over Ukraine or Taiwan. In strategic flexibility, it claims the U.S. has subordinated its own broader regional interests just to accommodate Israeli domestic politics. And in diplomatic credibility, using the UN veto over 40 times to shield one ally heavily erodes America's ability to build global coalitions, basically exposing a perceived hypocrisy to the entire global South. But it goes even further than that. The source traces a highly documented causal chain of radicalization and blowback. I mean, Osama bin Laden explicitly cited American support for Israel as a primary grievance back in his 1990s declarations. This is a fact fully documented by the 9/11 Commission when looking at al-Qaeda's recruitment strategies. The author argues that this specific brand of suicidal empathy directly fed the political blowback that eventually paved the way for the $2 trillion Iraq War. The text frames that war as a total catastrophe that fundamentally degraded America's own survival conditions. Now for Section 4, the strategic asset rebuttal, a second opinion. Because, of course, any rigorous diagnosis needs a second opinion. The primary counterargument to all of this is the very familiar strategic asset defense. The argument basically goes, hey, Israel provides incredibly valuable intelligence. They host military infrastructure, they share cutting-edge technology, and they act as a regional anchor for the U.S. Therefore, the relationship is actually a net positive strategic asset, and all those massive costs we just talked about, well, those are merely the necessary price of maintenance. But applying Saad's evolutionary logic, the source text swiftly neutralizes this defense on three distinct fronts. First, the old Cold War rationale for the alliance totally expired back in 1991. Second, intelligence and technology sharing is a two-way street. It serves their interests just as much as American ones, so it shouldn't be viewed simply as a payment for American support. And finally, and this is the big one for the evolutionary framework, if an asset costs you vital military readiness and global diplomatic credibility, the costs heavily outweigh the returns. In pure evolutionary biology terms, that makes the relationship strictly, undeniably maladaptive. Finally, Section 5, the parasitic wood cricket, underlying pathogens. So if the costs are this astronomical, why does the policy persist? Well, the explainer illustrates that it isn't monocausal. There's no single boogeyman. Instead, it's a multi-mechanism pathology, a perfect storm of several forces. You have evangelical theology removing conditionality for a massive 25 to 30% of the electorate. You have Holocaust guilt that automatically categorizes basic strategic scrutiny as bigotry. You have a massive lobbying infrastructure imposing brutal political costs on anyone who deviates. Add in everyday bureaucratic inertia and elite signaling, and the source argues you get these mutually reinforcing mechanisms that, together, completely shut off the American political system's adoptive survival instincts. And this, right here, is where Saad's framework hits its absolute climax, using this incredibly haunting biological metaphor of the wood cricket. In nature, if a wood cricket gets parasitized by a hairworm, it will inexplicably abandon its own survival instincts and literally leap to its death into a body of water. Why? Simply because the parasite's reproductive cycle requires water. The cricket's internal navigational systems are completely hijacked by an exogenous imperative, an outside command that totally overrides its own brain. And the source maps this exact biological phenomenon directly onto American politicians. Just as the biological host, the poor wood cricket, sacrifices itself for the hairworm, the political host subordinates their own national strategic interests just to ensure the ideological apparatus's reproduction. According to this framework, their political survival systems have been totally captured by that interlocking web of theology, guilt, and lobbying. The host country declines while the apparatus thrives. So what is the ultimate Subaladian verdict drawn by the source? Well, the diagnosis is clear. The three-step sequence is complete. This is empathy aroused by wildly inappropriate cues, where the normal evolutionary-based calculus of survival has been utterly eradicated. According to the author, we aren't just looking at bad optics or sloppy policy, we're looking at a terminal case of civilizational seppuku, where the massive strategic costs are intentionally disguised and made invisible to the taxpayers and soldiers who are ultimately forced to bear them. As we wrap up today's explainer, we're really left staring at this profound, massive question from the author's analysis. Think about it. How lethal is a pathology when it successfully disguises itself as a higher, noble goal? How can a nation possibly hope to cure an evolutionary misfiring when the disease itself has convinced the patient that their own natural survival instinct is somehow a moral failing? It is a complex, incredibly provocative framework, and it certainly forces us to look at international relations through a totally different lens. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive today, and as always, keep questioning the structures behind the strategy.